Hi, and thanks for joining me in this brief course on how to read the Bible for understanding. This is the session one, the introduction section, and we're just going to kind of get familiar with some of the terminology of this process of biblical interpretation and talk about kind of some of the whys. Why do we even need this? And that may be the first question that comes to your mind. Why do I even need a process for interpreting the Bible? I mean, can't I just read it and like do what it says, right? Well, basically, the problem is that what you have in the Bible is a 2 to 3 thousand year old text, right? Written in a completely different part of the world, a different culture, and in different languages. And so, how are you supposed to understand all of that when it's so kind of foreign to where we live? How many of you ever read Beowulf, like in college or high school? If you read it, but it's been a while, let me refresh your memory. Beowulf is this epic Old English poem, right? Written in the tradition of the Germanic hero legend. And it has over 3,000 lines in it, and it's almost impossible to understand. This is a bit of the problem with the Bible. It was originally written in different languages, different culture, different time period. There are basically 5 obstacles to understanding the Bible. And I want to just lay those out with you so you'll get a deeper understanding of why you even need a course like this and how to understand it. Now, my goal in this course is actually to help you overcome these 5 obstacles. So I wanted to lay them out for you right at the beginning. The first obstacle is linguistic, okay? Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 7 to 8 talk about this and tell us that this problem of understanding the scripture text is an ancient problem. It's a problem that you were having back in the days of Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 8, where it says this, the Levites, and the Levites were the priestly clan tribe of Israel. The Levites instructed the people in the law while the people were standing there. They read from the book of the law of God, making it clear and giving the meaning so that the people understood what was being read. You see, even back then, this priestly tribe of Levites had to interpret the scriptures to the people. So this is an ancient problem. The first one is linguistic. It's that the Bible was written in basically 2 languages. It was written in Hebrew, the Old Testament, and Greek, the New Testament, with a little bit of Aramaic sprinkled in. So you have Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew, languages that most people don't speak or can't read. And then we have people who are very knowledgeable in those languages translating into English. And in the English, you have multiple different translations. So the language is a part of that obstacle that we have to overcome. The second is cultural. For instance, in John chapter 2, verse 6, it says this. It's a story about Jesus, and it says, nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Okay, this is a scene out of the Gospel of John where Jesus is at this wedding, and it's describing this. But what does he mean by ceremonial washing? They were used for ceremonial washing. It's hard to understand that unless you understand the culture of that day. So this is a cultural disconnect. So, for instance, another example, John chapter 4, verse 9. It says this, the Samaritan woman said to him, to Jesus, you're a Jew and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. So if you're reading this and you don't understand the culture, you're asking, well, why not? Why don't Jews associate with Samaritans? And the scripture text doesn't tell us why. This is a cultural issue, and it's important to understand the culture behind what you're reading. So the third obstacle is historical. Okay, so there are a lot of things happening here that are in the Bible that are historical. They're deeply grounded in history, right? And so it's important for you to know the history. Oftentimes there are things happening around the biblical narrative that the Bible doesn't mention, but we know from extra biblical sources kind of the history of it, right? For instance, when Herod executes John the Baptist, and we understand that John the Baptist was speaking against Herod, and he had him executed. What the Bible doesn't tell us is that there was an entire war going on at that time, historically speaking, that Herod was involved with, and he was losing the war. And people were blaming him for losing the war. And so he had to get rid of John the Baptist because he was becoming a political liability. That's something we don't understand necessarily from the Bible, but we can get it from extra biblical kind of history. So there's this historical aspect that could be an obstacle for us. And the last and fifth is geographical. So there's all kinds of geography mentioned in the Bible. For instance, why do they always say we're going up to Jerusalem? Now, whether they're coming from the south or the north, they always say we're going up to Jerusalem. Well, Jerusalem was, altitude-wise, was pretty high. So no matter where you were coming from, you were climbing up to Jerusalem. This is part of the geography. And there are other things like that, where if you don't know the geography of the biblical lands, then you might be a little in the dark. So these are 5 of the biggest obstacles that hopefully in this process of teaching you how to understand the Bible, you're going to be able to overcome many of those. Let me just move very quickly into giving you a little bit of vocabulary. I just want to give you a few words that we're going to be using through this course that you probably need to know what they mean, right? And you may already know what they mean, you may not. But let's be sure. The first one is the word hermeneutics. And the word hermeneutics is basically a word that refers to the general process of interpreting the scripture text. It should actually be used to interpret any text, but in this case, we're using it to interpret the scriptures. And the word hermeneutics for me it encompasses all the aspects of that process. So there are all these other parts of the interpretive process that fall under the big umbrella we call hermeneutics. So hermeneutics is one of those very important words to understand. Another word is the word rhetoric. Now, rhetoric aims to study the techniques that writers or speakers use to inform, to persuade, or to motivate an audience in a specific situation. So rhetoric is basically just the art and craft and science of using words to inform people, to persuade people, to convince people of something. And so in the Bible, we have all kinds of different techniques that the writers use to try and convince you of things. That's called rhetoric. Another word that we use is a word called exegesis. And exegesis is part of the hermeneutical process. Remember, hermeneutics describes the whole process. Exegesis is one piece of that process that really refers to actually trying to mine the scripture text and pull out of it God's truth. That's called exegesis, where you take a scripture passage and you try to pull God's truth out of it. That's exegesis. The word actually means to draw out, right? So that's that word. Another word that we might use from time to time is the word homiletics. And homiletics is really just the process of turning all of the insights you have about the Bible, taking all of your study notes, everything you've learned through this interpretation process, and turning it into a sermon or a lesson. So that could be useful to some of you. Some of you may not care about homiletics at all. Others may. But it helps you take everything you've learned and turn it into some kind of presentation. Another word that I'll use from time to time is the word pericope. It's a Greek word. It comes from it means to cut around or to cut out. And a pericope is simply one section of scripture. It's usually meant to refer to one complete unit of scripture that tells one kind of complete story or one main idea. So when I refer to the pericope that we're studying, it's the section of scripture that we've cut out of the scripture to study. And then one last word that you probably need to know, and you probably already know, but the word is genre. And as you know, if you've studied literature, you studied English even, that genre is a type of literature that you are dealing with, the different types of literature. So there, in the Bible, for instance, there's history, there's story or narrative, poetry. There's a genre called the epistle, which is basically a letter, right? Paul's letters. It's a particular form of writing, a genre. The Gospels. Gospel actually became its own form of literature, its own genre, so to speak. There's parable, that's another genre. And within the genres, there's different techniques and different types of speech that they use, like metaphor, simile, irony, things like that. And so as we come to them, we'll point those out and we'll use those as well. So those are some of the more important kind of vocabulary words you need to know as we go into studying the text. So let me just kind of wrap it up by talking a little bit about the ultimate goal of what we're trying to do here. The main task that we call biblical hermeneutics or Bible interpretation, right? This whole process. What are we after? What are we trying to do? So there are certain biblical principles that transcend time and place. We've talked about how the Bible was written a long time ago, a foreign culture, a foreign language, a foreign time. So you might ask, well, how can any of that, what does that mean for me today? How can any of that have any relevance to my life? Well, the answer is that God has placed in His Word timeless principles that are still true today. They were true then and they're true now. And so the interpreter's task is to answer the question, what was the original writer or storyteller of the Bible attempting to say to the people that he was speaking to or writing to, right? When the Apostle Paul was writing his letters, say to the Corinthians, he had a particular people in mind, and he was trying to tell them something, right? And so we want to try and figure out what exactly was it that he was trying to tell them. And if we can get to that, this original intent, then inside of there is a timeless principle that can be identified. And that's really the golden nugget that we're after, right? Because once you've done that, then you can take that timeless principle and you can transfer it over time, right, across the centuries, and you can apply it for today. That timeless principle is still true today in our cultural setting. So it is this process then is what we're talking about. And then this process is what we're going to be studying. I'm going to kind of lay it out for you. And I'm not going to be able to go into any great depth in any part of it because this is just kind of a little mini course. This is meant just to give you an introduction to biblical interpretation. So we're not going to have time to go real deep, but it's that process I want to teach you of considering the historical, rhetorical, grammatical, sociocultural clues that are in the scripture, taking those into consideration, mining for the timeless principle, and then making a contemporary application using that timeless principle. And that is the essence of the interpretive process. And that's what I hope to help you or show you, teach you how we can do that. So thanks for coming along for the ride, and I can't wait to see you in the next session.